Hi, everyone. So I gave a talk recently about the intersection of market shaping and carbon removal verification, and a handful of folks asked me if I'd be up for sharing the talk. So I figured I'd do a little experiment here with a shareable recording. As a wonky talk, there's a bit of jargon to unpack along the way, and it starts right here with this mouthful of a title. The first section of the talk, I'm going to walk into what we mean by market shaping. So unpacking that is coming soon. But as for the other chunk of the title, throughout the talk, I use carbon removal and CDR as an acronym interchangeably. And then what I call verification here is otherwise often called MRV, or measurement, reporting, and verification. And the animating question behind the talk is, how the heck are we going to avoid the durable CDR industry just falling into the same quagmire as we see in today's voluntary offset market? And if there's a thesis statement, it's that market shaping is the best answer we have to that animating question, and that verification and quality assurance is the single most important aspect of market dynamics that we need to consciously and aggressively shape as we build the CDR industry in the coming years and decades. So there's two talks I could be giving. One would be a more prescriptive roadmap. Here's exactly what we need to do, starting with XYZ in phase one to get where we need to get with carbon removal verification. But I'm still early enough in my learning journey that I don't feel comfortable getting that prescriptive. So instead, this talk is meant to be more here's a mental model for market shaping introduction, and here's how that relates to the verification challenges in front of us, in the hopes of helping the community of folks who are working on or interested in carbon removal to build a shared mental model and some common language about the journey in front of us. And so there's a few sections here. One is just, what the heck do we mean by market shaping? Then I'm going to spend a bit of time just reflecting on what we've seen with quality assurance in healthcare and global health by way of analogy to learn from that experience. And then there's a few sections around how do we apply market shaping to carbon removal verification and some of the big themes there. So the best way to understand what market shaping is all about is by example. My friend and hero, Dr. Paul Farmer, died tragically earlier this year. And this is one of his friends and patients, Joseph Jeune, before and after getting on HIV treatment. And for 20 years, people who got to the stage you see on the left here had no chance of recovery. And even when effective treatment first became available, the talking heads consensus in the global health world was that it was a fool's errand to try to deliver treatment at scale, and that instead we should be exclusively focusing on HIV prevention. But fast forwarding to today, the punchline is that we've gone from almost no one on treatment in the global south to almost 30 million people on treatment in less than 20 years. Really one of the most underappreciated human success stories and miracles of the last 50 years. And the question is, how did we get there? There were a lot of barriers when the global community first started the scale-up effort. There weren't enough trained doctors and nurses in a lot of countries. There were big supply chain questions of how are we going to get drugs that need to be taken once or twice a day consistently out to rural Zambia. But right at the top of the list was incredibly expensive drugs. And so to enable HIV treatment to get to scale, we needed to drive drug prices way down and create essentially from scratch a large, healthy, high quality antiretroviral drug market across the global south. And there were sort of three big aspects or phases of that market shaping and market creation. The first one was just kickstarting the market in the first place, where we had this chicken and egg problem where there were high prices because demand was very low. And that meant, production volumes were very low. And so suppliers really hadn't started to come down the learning curve or the experience curve that enables them to drive down costs over time and translate that into lower prices. So we needed to get the market snowballing in the right direction to begin with. And then there were two things that needed to happen on an ongoing basis. So one was to basically every time we saw some dysfunction, predatory pricing or any other, unhealthy dynamic in the market start to crop up, we needed to steer aggressively from the bad movie risk toward the good movie version of what we thought and believed the market could become. And then the other big thing we needed to be doing was, as new technologies, in this case, new drugs and new drug regimens came to the market, they always had the same problem initially of no one's using them. They're new. There's not high awareness, but especially this recursive chicken and egg problem where, again, because initially the prices, the volume, the demand or usage of those drugs is low, the prices are high. Getting through that same chicken and egg problem needs to happen every time you have an important new technology hit the market. And so we needed to steward those technology waves as well. And so, fast forwarding again, not only have we gotten 30 million people now on antiretroviral treatment, which is what ART stands for there, but the drug prices have come down by more than 80%. They're now under $100 per patient per year. We have a big and healthy multi-billion-dollar market in the global South, and better regimens have become available that produce much better patient outcomes. And a lot of market shaping effort went into producing those outcomes. CHAI, which is the Clinton Health Access Initiative, where I used to work, was one of the leading market shaping organizations, not the only one, but the one I know best. And what is showing here is just a smattering of illustrative examples of the kinds of tactics and approaches that CHAI and its partners used to shape the market. Whether it was influencing World Health Organization treatment guidelines to incorporate as quickly as possible new regimens that were hitting the market, or establishing a buyers club to pool demand and de-risk demand for suppliers, or work with our partner suppliers who might all be struggling with sourcing a particular raw material at an affordable price. We might need to go on their behalf sort of collectively and negotiate with that upstream raw material supplier, or hire some process chemists to help improve yields on some enantioselective addition, at sort of step 5 of some key active ingredient manufacturing process, or getting market data out there so that people were more aware of the next regimens that were going to hit the market and what the pricing trends were. I mean, it really ran the gamut. And to pull this off, CHAI needed to build a local presence and a deep set of relationships on all sides of the market, buyers, suppliers, regulators, funders, opinion leaders, program implementers. And we needed to coordinate activity across all of these players, relentlessly anticipating and spotting blockages that are cropping up and resolving them. And that kind of shuttle diplomacy and relentless barrier whacking was the core of CHAI's work. And for lack of a better label, people started to call it quarterbacking. But then also, as needed, CHAI would partner with funders and other implementers to carry out innovative finance interventions, kind of like one example is the advanced market commitment that Frontier has created for carbon removal. We had sort of mini AMCs for HIV drugs, and we had volume guarantees, and we'll get into that in a moment. But we would sort of create and execute these innovative finance interventions to accelerate demand or drive down prices or help a particular set of new products gain faster penetration. And when you zoom out from just that laundry list of interventions, you can think of 3 main categories of market shaping activity. Influencing, let me just see where I can move this video to get it out of the way. Influencing government action and policy, innovative finance interventions, like I was just mentioning, and quarterbacking. The first category is pretty self-explanatory, although it involves much more than just pushing for big sort of Inflation Reduction Act style national legislation. As regards the innovative finance interventions, these kind of often, but not always, involved some form of de-risking or accelerating or pooling demand. They were often demand side interventions. Sometimes people called them pull interventions. And thanks to Nan and the Frontier team, we've now got one early example in durable carbon removal. In global health, we use pretty much all the tools listed here, and there's more that aren't listed there. There are even now some institutions like MedAccess that exist specifically to implement a given tool, in their case, volume guarantees, again and again against different problems. As far as the logos I've listed at the bottom here, these are just examples, and almost by definition, market shaping organizations usually cut across more than one of these buckets in their activities. And so the way I've tagged logos to buckets is a bit misleading. You know, taking Chai as an example, what Chai did cut across all of these buckets, but in doing kind of whatever was needed to move a market, quarterbacking was in some ways sort of the governing lens. And zooming out even further, to think about what the essence of market shaping is, what it is this stuff on the left here. So it is one or more private entities engaging in a set of activities and interventions. Sometimes it was public-private partnerships, but usually, a private entity thinking ahead to really build alignment around the future state. How should this market work? What dynamics do we, think this market needs to have? What architecture does it need to have? And then lastly, amassing and deploying different forms of soft power and financial power to be able to steer the market aggressively in that direction toward that future state. What it isn't is the narrower things on the right, just a government regulating, just a buyer buying or a seller selling. Those kinds of things do shape markets, but they're not what we mean by market shaping here. What we mean is a much more holistic view taken by one or more entities of this is what we want the market to look like down the road. This is where we see it today. Here's what we think we need to do to, help this market get from place A to place B by pulling as many different levers as we can. So shifting gears, what can we learn from how quality assurance has worked in healthcare and global health? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because the particulars are so different and because we didn't do nearly as much quality-related market shaping in global health as we will need to with high durability carbon removal, where quality assurance is in some ways a far knottier problem with a much more heterogeneous set of pathways and a less developed at this stage institutional architecture for verification and quality assurance. But it's worth at least a brief spin through healthcare history because we haven't always had great quality assurance in healthcare any more than we do in today's carbon offsets market. Rewinding to the 19th century and well into the 20th century, you had this crazy landscape of patent medicines and snake oil salesmen peddling all kinds of cures, many of which didn't work. Some of which worked, but maybe a little too well. And if you fast forward to where we are today, where you've got, the FDA and well-developed clinical trial methodologies and standards, we didn't just get there overnight. Something really important happened in between, which basically amounted to private market shaping. So, from this stage, before we got to the FDA, in 1905, the American Medical Association started to feel like, hey, we are facing an existential reputational risk to the medical profession. And this market being totally unregulated just isn't going to work. And so the AMA set up a new wing called the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry. And the CPC started to do its own lab and safety testing of medicines on the market. They developed an ever-growing set of testing protocols and standards. And if you were a drug manufacturer and you wanted to advertise in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was the preeminent or one of the preeminent journals, you couldn't do that unless you passed CPC testing. And even if you didn't voluntarily offer your drug up for CPC testing, if they reached out and tested your product and your product didn't clear their bar, they would write you up publicly in this nice little tome called Nostrums and Quackery and Pseudomedicine. And they issued a whole bunch of volumes of these. And so they were out there naming and shaming. And then eventually, what happened was the FDA, as the enabling legislation for the FDA playing a bigger and bigger role came into place, the FDA was able to adopt a lot of the standards and processes that the AMA's Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry had developed, and just incorporate those by reference and reliance and start using them in the FDA's regulatory apparatus. And that same sort of process of going from, Wild West to private market shaping or private standards and arrangements to government regulation that often piggybacks on and adopts those private, standards and arrangements. That's happened elsewhere. We've seen that with standards generally. The ISO is a non-governmental organization. We've seen that with the internet and the role that this guy, John Tester, played in the early going that later got absorbed by ICANN, which is, essentially the government delegating some of its authority to private actors, whether it's, government delegated authority or whether it's private arrangements that the government, sort of incorporates by reference and reliance. This is a pattern that we see again and again. Shifting gears for a moment from healthcare, particularly US lens healthcare, to global health and what we've seen in the last 20 years, it's worth thinking about and learning from how we developed this institutional architecture for quality assurance and verification, and particularly how this theme of centralizing that versus decentralizing that set of functions, like how that evolved. Because the question is like, what do you do when you've got a decentralized international market with many potential verifiers and regulators? 20 years ago, we had a drug regulatory architecture that just wasn't set up to support a big global market across the global South. If we put ourselves in 2002, each country had its own equivalent of the FDA, but many of these national regulators are, or were at least, and some of them continue to be, very weak and non-rigorous because they don't have a lot of capacity built up. And they also all had very different requirements that you had to meet as a manufacturer. So you might have to redo your fed fasting study, for example, 3 different ways to meet, or 20 different ways to meet 20 different national regulators' requirements. And as a buyer, if I'm, say, Doctors Without Borders in 2003, and I want to buy malaria drugs from an Indian generic supplier to use at my clinics in Uganda, I may not trust the Ugandan drug regulator or even the Indian drug regulator to ensure the quality of those those generic malaria medicines. But I can't get the FDA to review a dossier for a drug that's still on patent in the US and not going to be sold there. So what can I trust? And then in the space of just a couple of years, 20 years ago, 2 new huge funding sources for global health came online. The Global Fund and PEPFAR, which was President Bush's big HIV program. And the scale of that kind of Doctors Without Borders conundrum I just mentioned became way, way bigger, because now we have billions and billions of dollars to go buy drugs and diagnostics and everything that we're going to need to scale up treatment programs for HIV and other diseases. And so to solve the problem, these new funders created a new construct, essentially out of thin air, this definition of a stringent regulatory authority. That initially included the FDA and its analogs in most countries in the global north. And critically, it also included this relatively new unit within the World Health Organization called the WHO Pre-Qualification Program, that has no national borders or IP constraints on what it can review, And now our Indian generic manufacturer, in that example I took a minute ago, can turn to any of these stringent regulatory authorities to get the quality stamp of approval it needs, and one that funders and buyers can rely on. So these funders essentially drew a line and said, these verifiers or, quality assurers are good enough. These ones that fall below the line of an SRA, threshold are not good enough. And, they create this concept out of nowhere. One of the predictable problems, though, was that the WHO pre-qualification program was often painfully slow in reviewing dossiers and issuing approvals. And over time, the FDA has evolved its approach by getting more into like a verify the verifiers mode, where it systematically reviews the practices and the capacity of national regulators in a modular way, looking at this aspect of their capacity and that aspect, and rating them ultimately on a 4-tier scale, and offering them a pathway to becoming what are now called WHO listed authorities. And over time, the idea is that this WLA construct will replace the SRA construct. And instead of just having rigorous verifiers in the global north, we'll have a more equitably distributed architecture where the Tanzanian FDA or whatever can become a WLA. And as the list of WLAs grows, more and more of the actual quality assurance work will be pushed out to national regulators instead of just having to be done by the WHO pre-qualification program. And so it's this sort of new balance in the spectrum from total centralization to total decentralization. And zooming out, there's been a few big themes in all this over the last 20 years when it comes to market shaping. First, lots of different efforts to harmonize requirements across countries so that suppliers don't have to jump through a crazy number of hoops and redo things like fed fasting studies so many different ways to satisfy different regulators. Second, that evolving balance in the architecture that I was just talking about between centralization and decentralization. And yet one that even as we progressively, decentralize, we still have the WHO acting as a source of truth and defining and holding the rigor bar for all other verifiers in the market. And then third, the big funders and buyers using their heft to steer quality arrangements to suit their needs and preferences. So they were the ones that created this SRA concept. They've been pushing the WHO to change its approach. They've been bolstering the WHO's capacity to do, for the pre-qualification program and so forth. And so now coming back to the main event of carbon removal verification, how do we apply some of this? How do we conceptualize the market shaping challenge in front of us with high quality, durable, high durability CDR verification? Today's offset market is deeply problematic. It's rife with quality problems and extremely hard to navigate, even for relatively sophisticated buyers. And I won't parse all the, structural and path-dependent reasons why we've wound up with the bad movie we currently see. But as we think about how we might avoid durable carbon removal becoming a bad sequel to today's voluntary markets, it's really important to start from the premise that how we got here was not preordained, but entirely path-dependent. Globally, we've just been too asleep at the market-shaping wheel. So we can think of this market shaping for carbon removal verification as a race against time, a race to ensure that the verification arrangements we need develop as fast or faster than the high durability carbon removal market shifts from niche to mainstream, when we're going to have a lot more buyers enter the market who are not as forward-thinking or acting in the best long-term interest of the market as some of the early buyers we have who are willing to pay the current price premiums for carbon removal. And so there's sort of two aspects of this race before we get to the risk of a sort of race to the bottom, lowest common denominator situation. One side of it is the R&D or science race, all the things on the left of the slide here. And the other part of this is the market architecture race, all the kinds of things on the right-hand side. And what that all amounts to is essentially redefining what is socially and eventually what is legally acceptable, so that we're not relying on enlightened buyer behavior or decision making about what they're willing to buy, but instead are relying on well-established models, sensors, studies, standards, norms, institutional architecture that just makes this kind of easy and automatic, and where the quality bar is kind of drawn for you as a buyer, rather than you having to figure it all out yourself. And this construct on this slide is a bit of an oversimplification, but just to have a crude mental model to work with, we can think of the durable CDR market's evolution in these 4 stages: infancy, toddler, adolescence, and adulthood. And against that series of horizons, it feels like we're just coming out of infancy and entering toddlerdom right now. The time frames I've tagged here could be a bit off, but bear with me for now on this kind of straw man way of thinking about it. And to be clear, here we're talking about the high durability CDR market more narrowly, but ultimately high durability CDR needs to compete with and win out in the offsets market more generally. So when we think about market shaping, we need to be thinking both about that narrower high durability market and eventually about the broader market. From a verification perspective and our quality assurance perspective, one of the key things to parse is the distinctions between that toddler stage we're entering and the adolescent stage, because what's right for one stage isn't right for the other. I won't read out what's on the slide, but briefly, during the toddler stage, it feels like the overriding premium is on innovation and iteration and flexibility and figuring out what works and how things should work. We can't be in such a hurry to nail things down that we accidentally crowd out new approaches or pathways or suppliers. And during this stage, we can afford to have underdeveloped and less consensus verification arrangements or architecture, because we're still in a niche market, and one where purchase transactions are almost all kind of private in character. So for now, we can keep putting one foot in front of the other and give things time to percolate. But when we start hitting inflection points later this decade, with scale up and with purchase transactions starting to have more and more public character, we need to consciously shift modes and get the home team aligned on how we think things should work, and then aggressively map backward from that to drive the market in that direction. And we have to be a bit ahead of the curve, because that's the way we don't wind up in the hard to recover from kind of hot mass market situation we have with today's offsets market. But the rub is that we need to do that sort of coalescing and market shaping without overly rigidifying and bureaucratizing, because there's no reason to believe that the pace of innovation will slow in the medium term. And we can come back to that a bit later in the talk as we get into the dynamics more. Just to dwell for a moment on this private versus public tons notion I was talking about on the last slide, clearly there's no bright line, all of a sudden moment where a shift like this happens. But we're clearly heading toward a world where explicit government involvement and public interest implications are in play much more often in a much bigger way, and with transparency expectations growing in tandem. So this kind of it's all between the buyer and seller mentality, or as long as the buyer is happy, we're all good, that you sometimes hear today, won't last long in the grand scheme. So there's a couple of key themes in carbon removal verification market shaping that I wanted to dwell on. The first one is just how rich and high stakes this question of transparency and openness is when it comes to verification. And there are a bunch of different aspects of openness and transparency that we presumably care about, some of which are listed here, regarding both access to intellectual property and also access to information or data. When it comes to data at the bottom there, we could care about transparency of, the field data attached to a particular ton, some of the ground truthing data we're going to need for models that we'll rely on, life cycle analysis data and other metadata about a project that's not connected to any particular ton, and so forth. And if we think about two ends of the spectrum for a moment, the closed end and the open end of this spectrum, and to clarify, this has nothing to do with what we sometimes call closed system carbon removal or open system carbon removal. This is just about the openness or closedness of the sort of market paradigm for transparency and access. And obviously, this is a spectrum, not a binary, but it seems that our goal should be to push as far in the direction of radical transparency as we possibly can. And today there's some understandable pause about taking that path. Some carbon removal companies are seeking to build competitive advantage, an edge around verification, and expecting that they'll be able to keep their verification innovations to themselves. And meanwhile, radical transparency with data and information is rarely comfortable. And in some cases, there may actually be practical hard limits on what's shareable, like farm-related data is a particularly, sort of tricky example of what you can and can't share. But the stakes of openness are just incredibly high with carbon removal. And it's kind of hard to imagine how we get this market to the promised land with something far short of the open paradigm. If we fall far short, we risk losing public trust. We risk seeing less rigor and less atmospheric impact, slowing the pace of innovation because, supplier A can't piggyback on, supplier B's innovation, and just overall impeding the growth of the market with a bunch of information asymmetries clogging up the works. And just one last note on this theme is that IP protection itself isn't necessarily the problem. We want to incentivize companies to invest in verification innovation, and being able to patent protect is one of, though not the only means of doing that. So instead of thinking about IP protection as a yes-no thing, the key question is whether, again, like supplier A can use something that supplier B developed in working on its, its own sort of verification methods or sensors or whatever. How can we enable that piggybacking and sort of layer by layer innovation? In the global health world, this has largely gotten solved through voluntary licensing. And where a growing share of that licensing happens through a central patent pool called the Medicines Patent Pool that streamlines things and aligns terms and enables suppliers to put their IP into a pool that the pool then sublicenses out to other manufacturers and creates a flow of royalties back to the intellectual property holders. Suppliers both get royalties for participating, and they also face a bunch of downsides that I'm not going to go into if they don't participate, because there are actors in the ecosystem that are creating really strong incentives for them to participate, and that gets back to market shaping tactics and how you can make this sort of a really easy choice for suppliers to participate in this kind of thing. The second theme I wanted to highlight is this reality of uncertainty-laden carbon removal pathways that Carbon Plan and Frontier so helpfully brought to the fore last month in the work they published. And this sort of, irreducible uncertainty, reducible, but ultimately at some level, irreducible uncertainty that they described raises a whole bunch of challenges for the field. And at first blush, it might seem like all these uncertainties about different pathways might be pure downside for us. But thinking about it more deeply, we can see how there's big silver lining lurking here. If we square up to the uncertainty, I think you have to buy into this discounting line of thinking that Frontier and Carbon Plan were making the case for, that we're going to have to discount how much credit we give for a given deployment of carbon removal, how many tons we say it represented, in order to make for buying that is principled. And and that actually has the atmospheric impact we want it to. And so if we can bring the market along with that idea that we're going to have to say, this ton had this much uncertainty in the degree to which it actually removed what we thought it did, or this theoretical ton, therefore we're going to only credit this amount. If you take that discounting line of thinking, there are two big implications. One is we're in a world of non-binary crediting, and two, we're tethering uncertainty levels to cost and price. Because if you do that discounting, then the more uncertain your carbon removal was, the less credit you're going to get for it, and therefore the higher price per unit of theoretical removal. In healthcare, we don't and can't have that kind of non-binary system. Given the life and death stakes, we either conclude a drug clears the bar or it doesn't. We don't want a system where people with less money pay a quarter as much for a drug that's as quarter as good. But with these two attributes of CDR discounting, we actually can unlock a bunch of advantages, whether that's creating this structural incentive because of the tethering. Let me just get back to where we were. Whether it's this sort of like structural incentive for suppliers to reduce uncertainty in order to reduce their pricing, whether it's making it easier for new suppliers to enter the market, because even if they have more underdeveloped verification arrangements at first and have higher uncertainty levels, they can still sell. It's not like there's some absolute bar that if you don't clear this bar right away, you can't sell. No, welcome to the market. You can start selling. Just if you have more uncertainty and less effective, verification at constraining that uncertainty, you're going to initially be selling at a higher price. This also makes it easier for suppliers outside the global north to enter initially. It creates the option for flexibility in the system where you can have upgradable and downgradable ratings according to how the uncertainty evolves. A whole bunch of things that this kind of paradigm will unlock, and it creates ultimately this path to ensuring rigor while accommodating ongoing innovation and learning and market entry. So those are the two main themes that I wanted to highlight. Just to take one example of this last theme, if you imagine a new, bio-oil supplier, a bio-oil carbon removal supplier in Kenya with less well-developed verification, they can come in and they, instead of just being unable to sell any tons initially, they can enter the market, but at that higher price point. And then early adopter market shaping buyers can buy from them because they might say, hey, we want to expand carbon removal supply in Kenya. And yeah, this supplier can't compete with Charm Industrial or whoever initially, but we want to, be an early buyer of first resort from them while they come up the verification and certainty curve to drive prices down. And then they can compete, in the mass market, on a more equal footing. And so that's this sort of like, opening that this paradigm can create for us. Moving on, the ultimate question is, well, what's it going to take to do the market shaping we're going to need to take advantage of and actually ensure that we wind up with a more transparent market with a strong institutional architecture that really incorporates, these uncertainty and discounting principles we were just talking about, everything we want in this market. How are we going to get it there? So just recapping from earlier, the essence of market shaping, what we need to do is to build alignment around the optimal market outcomes and dynamics we're looking for. Then we need to go amass soft power and financial power. And then we need to deploy that power to steer the market toward those optimal features. And there's a bunch of different kinds of soft power and financial power. It's not just buying power and the how well known your brand is. There's all the kinds of soft power on the left, all the different kinds of financial power on the right. And you definitely don't need to have all of these kinds of power to do market shaping. Though over time, situationally, most of these things will become important. And reflecting on Chai's experience in global health, Chai either had or built or partnered with others to bring to bear pretty much everything on this slide at some point in time in the course of its market shaping work. So who does the market shaping? At some level, it's all of us. Anyone who votes with their feet toward the dynamics and arrangements we're trying to steer toward is shaping the market. Whether you're, a buyer buying something consistent with XYZ, best practice principles or whatever, and especially anyone who uses their soft power to speak up and partner and bring others along with them toward that desired future state. But there are a couple of players or types of players who particularly need to be at the forefront of market shaping. One is big buyers using their buying power to steer the market. I've written a bunch about Frontier, but Frontier obviously won't be the only big buyer over time. And the other is Chai-style quarterbacks. And typically, these are organizations either whose entire mission is about market shaping and quarterbacking, or who have a wing of the organization dedicated to it. And we don't have a lot of these in carbon removal yet. But I will point out, one of the themes I've been writing about is big buyers themselves can opt to do more than just buying and actually get into quarterbacking. And Frontier has begun to do some of this. And one of the questions is, how expansively will Frontier or other big buyers decide to get into some quarterbacking? And then what quarterbacks might emerge who are not big buyers themselves? Because Chai was a non-buyer quarterback. Chai didn't actually buy HIV drugs, but it was out there pursuing mission-driven work to shape the market. And then sort of at the base of the pyramid, you've got these other two types of players, so governments and foundations or private philanthropy. And, in the case of private foundations, they're primarily using their dollars to fund market shaping efforts, whether they're funding quarterbacks or funding innovative finance interventions. Or standing up new ecosystem entities that need to exist. And secondarily, they're using their soft power to influence market actors the way the Gates Foundation did so powerfully in global health. Although even the Gates Foundation sometimes steered in the wrong direction. And sometimes as a market shaper, you need to be influencing opinion leaders and steering what the Gates Foundation was out there saying was a big part of what Chai was doing. Meanwhile, governments can also fund market shaping efforts, but even more importantly, they can lend their regulatory and legislative and procurement weight to reinforce emerging private market arrangements that are, steering in a healthy direction. So that's a bit on the who. If we think about what do those who's need to be out there doing? We've talked about some of this already, but the list of verification related market shaping tactics and approaches is pretty long, and it falls into at least 4 buckets. So the first one is shaping buyer behavior. How do we get buyers to use their leverage with suppliers to get suppliers to do what we need them to do, which is coming in a moment? How do we get them to use the higher rigor verifiers rather than the lower rigor ones? How do we get them to adopt those, discounting principles in the way they buy and so forth? Then we need to, both via buyers and via others, shape supplier behavior so that suppliers are engaging in transparency related behaviors and licensing their IP and helping steer buyers toward the higher rigor verifiers. We need to do a lot to accelerate innovation, R&D prizes for new sensors or little mini frontiers or volume guarantees, which is what VG stands for particular new carbon removal pathways that are emerging and that might initially have that sort of chicken and egg problem that other pathways that have been around for longer have already gotten over. So again, that's sort of accelerating waves of technology development. And then how do we steer philanthropy toward what Frontier and Carbon Plan were calling sort of system responsibility uncertainty reduction for some carbon removal pathways. Air, sea flux with ocean alkalinity enhancement. How do we get some great research done on that to reduce the uncertainty connected to that in a way that enables the development of that pathway, the market for that pathway, because prices come down when uncertainty comes down. And then lastly here, creating new things, standing up entirely new verifiers or organizations that can convene processes to develop and constantly update standards and protocols, or creating a patent pool. There are going to be new things that we need in the ecosystem that market shapers will need to help stand up. And then lastly, on this, how does it happen front, there's just the more tactical, how do you actually steer behavior and decisions at the margin? There's a whole toolkit here. And one way of parsing that toolkit is the 3 buckets I talked about toward the start of the talk, influencing policy, using innovative finance mechanisms, and quarterbacking. But another way of parsing it is to think about these sort of tactical nuances where you are trying to incentivize financially, you're trying to create peer pressure, you're influencing with ideas and so forth. But one often overlooked tactic is this third one listed here. You can think of it kind of as like a Godfather tactic. How can you make people offers that they can't refuse by saying, we will only do X if you agree to do Y? And so just to take a couple of illustrative examples of that, a big buyer like Frontier could come to a supplier and say, hey, if you want us to do an offtake agreement for you, we will only treat you as eligible for our offtake agreements if you agree to participate in this patent pool or whatever else you're trying to get the supplier to do. That's just one example. Or if you're trying to steer buyer behavior, you could create a buyers club with really great benefits of being a member and require them to use certain high rigor verifiers in order to be eligible to participate in this buyers club. So that was a really common kind of approach that Chai took and that its partners took to steer behavior, was these kind of like Godfather offers. Just to wrap up, I think at the end of the day, this verification we've been talking about at one level is about just measuring and verifying tons, but it's really much more than that, because this is about shaping the overall carbon removal market that we need. And our verification arrangements will have just far-reaching implications for the market's character, for how fast it ramps up, and its impact on the atmosphere and biosphere. Increasingly over time, we can't be afraid to use every tool and every source of power we have to steer hard toward what we think is optimal, whether that's enabling CDR supply across the global south or creating more competition by enabling more suppliers to get into the market more quickly, or whether that's increasing the pace of innovation through intellectual property access, or all these different themes we've talked about. Quality is kind of the linchpin and the avenue through which we are going to, or one of the main avenues, probably the most central one in the coming years, through which we're going to go get all of these other market shaping priorities executed. It's kind of a battle for the soul and the success of the whole carbon removal enterprise that's on all of us to pitch in on. So my plea is, let's all grab a pen or a pitchfork and a wand or a broomstick, and let's help get the job done. Thanks for bearing with me. If you're interested in reading more of some of the thinking I've been putting out there around carbon removal, you can find me on Twitter and Substack here, and look forward to the next time around. Thanks for sticking with it.